The aircraft carrier headed out to sea, determined to turn the war effort around for her nation. Half-sister to two infamous battleships, she was heavily armored and ready for battle. Or so everyone thought. As she zigzagged through the sea, a submarine lurked nearby, ready to strike. As the carrier's broadside turned to just the right angle, the stars aligned, and the torpedoes fired. Welcome to Shipwreck Sunday. My name is Eleanor. Just a quick disclaimer for a younger audience before we dive in. This story may be disturbing to some, so viewer discretion is advised. Okay everyone, let's get into it. Shinano, named after the Shinano province, was originally one of two additional Yamato-class battleships ordered as part of the 4th Naval Armament Supplement Program in 1939. As planned, she was laid down on May 4, 1940 at the Yokosuka Naval Arsenal as a modified version of the Yamato-class. As with her half-sisters Yamato and Musashi, her construction was kept top secret. It was so severe that even mentioning the ship's construction could result in serious punishment, including the death penalty. There are only 3 known photographs of this ship, so I'm so sorry, but you'll see those repeatedly. In December of 1941, construction on Shinano was temporarily stopped so that the IJN would have time to make some decisions regarding the ship after the attack on Pearl Harbor. She truly wasn't expected to hit the seas until 1945, so they had lots of time to make decisions. With the sinking of the British capital ships Prince of Wales and repulsed by IJN aircraft, this really called into question just how viable battleships are. The Navy also wanted to use the dry dock Shinano was occupying, so it either needed to be scrapped or completed. The IJN decided to finish the ship, but not as a battleship. In the month following the disastrous loss of 4 fleet carriers at the Battle of Midway, the IJN ordered Shinano to be completed as an aircraft carrier. Her hull, at this time, was only 45% completed, so she'd be a more heavily armored support carrier instead of a full-blown carrier. Before we get too much further into Shinano's story, let's look at her specs. As an aircraft carrier, Shinano displays 64,800 long tons standard and 72,000 long tons fully loaded, making her the heaviest aircraft carrier built at the time. She was 872 feet 2 inches long overall, had a beam of 119 feet 1 inch wide, and a draft of 33 feet 10 inches deep. Her complement averaged 2,400 officers and enlisted. Let's look at propulsion. It was identical to that of the Yamato-class battleships, so she was fitted with 12 Kampon water tube boilers, which powered 4 geared steam turbine sets with a total of 150,000 shaft horsepower, each driving 1 propeller shaft. Shinano and the 2 Yamato-class battleships had a designed speed of 27 knots, but Shinano never actually conducted full-speed sea trials, so her actual performance is a mystery to us. I'd imagine she was slower due to her heavy displacement. She did carry 8,904 long tons of fuel oil, which gave her an estimated range of 10,000 nautical miles at 18 knots. She's an aircraft carrier, but since she was originally planned as a battleship, her armor and armament setup is unique. She was much more heavily armored and armed than most other carriers. For armament, she had 8 twin-mounted 5-inch dual-purpose guns, 35 triple-mounted 1-inch anti-aircraft guns, and 12 28-barrel 4.7-inch anti-aircraft rocket launchers. As for armor, she had waterline belt armor that was between 6.3 and 15.7 inches thick, depending upon location, and flight deck armor that was 3 inches thick. Now we get into the meat and potatoes of aircraft carriers, the aircraft and flight deck. Shinano was designed to load and fuel her aircraft on deck since this was safer. Loading and fueling below decks proved to be a real danger to carriers if they were attacked while doing so. Much of Shinano's hangar was left open for better ventilation, although steel shutters could close off most of the hangar sides if necessary. This allowed ordnance or burning aircraft to be jettisoned into the sea, something earlier carriers could not do. Her flight deck was 839 feet 11 inches long and 131 feet 3 inches wide, overhanging at both ends, supported by pairs of pillars. Based upon Tai-Ho, a large island was sponsored off the starboard side and integrated with her funnel. Also like Tai-Ho, she had unarmored sides to her hangar. Tai-Ho had sunk due to an explosion of avgas fumes, so Shinano had large ventilation fans installed on the hangar deck to expel fumes in case of damage to her gasoline system. As for aircraft, her organic air group was intended to consist of 18 Mitsubishi A7M SAM fighters plus 2 in storage, 18 Aichi B-7A Grace torpedo dive bombers plus 2 in storage, and 6 Nakajima C-6N MERT reconnaissance aircraft plus 1 in storage. The remainder of her hangar space was supposed to house up to 120 replacement aircraft for other carriers and land bases. Shinano's career should have been long and illustrious, but it would be cut short. Thank you so much to our amazing YouTube members and patrons. If you'd like to have some awesome perks like episodes a full day in advance, join our YouTube memberships today. Alright, time to continue with her career. The ship was originally scheduled for completion in April of 1945, but construction was expedited after the defeat at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, as the IJN anticipated that the United States would now be able to bomb Japan with long-range aircraft from bases in the Mariana Islands. The builder was unable to increase the number of workers on Shinano and stated they could not meet the new deadline of October. Even so, the absolute pressure to get this ship out on the water led to poor workmanship by the workforce, which would contribute to her loss. Shinano's launch on October 8, 1944, with Captain Toshio Abe in command, was marred by what some considered a bad omen. During the floating out procedure, one of the caissons, which is a watertight retaining structure at the end of the dock that had not been properly ballasted with seawater, unexpectedly lifted as the water rose to the level of the harbor. This sudden inrush of water into the graving dock pushed the carrier into the forward end, damaging her bow structure below the waterline and requiring repairs in dry dock. These would be done by October 26th. On November 19, 1944, Shinano was formally commissioned at Yokosuka, having spent the last 2 weeks fitting out and performing sea trials, but again, no full-speed sea trials. Unfortunately for Shinano, on the exact same day as her commissioning, a B-29 bomber observed Yokosuka and photographed the base, producing one of the 3 known pictures of her. Worried for her safety after the flyover, the Navy General Staff ordered Shinano to head for Kure by no later than November 28th, where the remainder of her fitting out would take place. Abe asked for a delay as the majority of her watertight doors had yet to be installed, the compartment air tests were not done yet, and many holes in the compartment bulkheads for electric cables, ventilation ducts, and pipes were not sealed yet. Also, her fire mains and bailing systems were currently inoperable, and even though most of the crew had seagoing experience, they lacked training in these particular portable pumps on the ship. The escorting destroyers, Isokaze, Yukikaze, and Hamakaze, had just returned from the Battle of Leyte Gulf and required more than 3 days to conduct repairs and to allow their crews to recuperate. Abe's request was denied, and Shinano departed as scheduled with the escorting destroyers at 4 p.m. on November 28th. Abe commanded a crew of 2,175 officers and men. Also on board were 300 shipyard workers and 40 civilian employees. Watertight doors and hatches were left open for ease of access to machinery spaces, as were some manholes in the double and triple bottomed hull. Abe preferred a daylight passage since it would have allowed him extra time to train his crew and given the destroyer crews time to sleep. However, he was forced into a nighttime run when he learned the Navy General Staff could not provide any air support. Shinano carried 6 Shinyo suicide boats and 50 Oka suicide flying bombs, and her other aircraft weren't planned to come aboard until later. She was ordered to go to Kure, and here she'd complete fitting out and then deliver the kamikaze craft to the Philippines and Okinawa. Traveling at an average speed of 20 knots, it would take 16 hours to cover the 300 miles to Kure. To show how important Shinano was to the Naval Command, Abe was slated to be promoted to Rear Admiral once fitting out was completed. At 6:48 p.m., the American submarine Archerfish, commanded by Commander Joseph F. Einright, detected Shinano and her escorts on her radar and pursued them on a parallel course. Over an hour and a half earlier, Shinano had detected the submarine's radar. Normally, Shinano would have been able to outrun Archerfish, but the zigzagging movement of her and her escorts, intending ironically enough to evade American submarines, inadvertently put the task force back into the Archerfish's path on numerous occasions. At 8:45 p.m., the carrier's lookouts spotted Archerfish on the surface and Isokaze broke formation against orders to investigate. Abe ordered the destroyer to return to formation without attacking because he believed the submarine was part of an American wolf pack, which meant there would be numerous submarines. He assumed archerfish was being used as a decoy to lure away one of the escorts to allow the rest of the pack a clear shot at Shinano. He ordered the ships to turn away from the submarine, hoping to outrun it. At 9:22 p.m., the carrier was forced to reduce her speed to 18 knots, the same speed as archerfish, to prevent damage to the propeller shaft when a bearing overheated. At 2:56 a.m. on November 29th, Shinano turned to the southwest and headed straight for archerfish. 8 minutes later, archerfish turned east and submerged in preparation to attack. Einright ordered his torpedoes set for a depth of 10 feet in case they ran deeper than set, and he also intended to increase the chances of capsizing Shinano by blowing holes into it higher up on the hull. A few minutes later, Shinano turned south, exposing her entire side to archerfish, pretty much inviting the submarine to fire on her. The escorting destroyer on that side passed right over archerfish, none the wiser. At 3:15 a.m., the submarine fired 6 torpedoes before diving to 400 feet to escape a depth charge attack from the escorts. 4 of the 6 torpedoes struck Shinano at an average depth of 14 feet. The first hit towards the stern, flooding refrigerated storage compartments and one of the empty aviation gasoline storage tanks and killing many of the sleeping engineering personnel in the compartments above. The second hit the compartment where the starboard outboard propeller shaft entered the hull and flooded the outboard engine room. The third hit further forward, flooding the number 3 boiler room and killing every man on watch there. Structural failures caused the 2 adjacent boiler rooms to flood as well. The fourth flooded the starboard air compressor room, adjacent anti-aircraft gun magazines, and the number 2 damage control station and ruptured the adjacent oil tank. Though the damage was indeed severe, the crew initially did not know this and thought it was manageable. The crew were confident in the ship's armor and strength, which translated then into lax initial efforts to save Shinano. This overconfidence even extended to Captain Abe, as he doubted the torpedoes could do any serious damage, since he knew American torpedoes were less potent than their Japanese counterparts. Apparently, he didn't learn about Lusitania. Torpedoes are not to be trifled with. Overconfident in his ship's abilities, he ordered the carrier to maintain maximum speed even after the last torpedo hit. This pushed even more water into the hull, resulting in massive flooding. Within just a few minutes, Shinano was listing 10 degrees to starboard. Despite the crew's best efforts pumping 3,000 long tons of water into the port bilges, the list increased to 13 degrees. It soon became apparent the damage was more severe than anticipated, so Abe ordered a change of course towards Shiono Point, the southernmost tip of Honshu's Key Peninsula. Progressively, the flooding worsened, as did the listing to 15 degrees by 3:30 a.m. 50 minutes later at 4:20 a.m., Abe ordered the empty port outboard tanks to be counter-flooded, reducing the listing to 12 degrees briefly. After 5 a.m., Abe ordered the civilian workers to be transferred to the escorts as they were just getting in the way of the crew. Half an hour later, Shinano was still making 10 knots even with a 13-degree list, and at 6 a.m., her list unfortunately increased to 20 degrees after the starboard boiler room flooded, at which point the valves of the port trimming tanks rose above the waterline and were no longer working. Her engines shut down due to the lack of steam around 7 a.m., and Abe ordered all of the propulsion compartments evacuated at 8 a.m. He then ordered the 3 outboard port boiler rooms flooded to try to right the listing, but this was for nothing. He also then ordered Hamakaze and Isokaze to take her in tow. However, these 2 destroyers only displaced 4,900 long tons between the 2 of them, about 1/14 of Shinano's displacement and not nearly enough to overcome her dead weight. The first 2 cables snapped under the strain, and the second attempt was aborted for fear of injury to the crews if they snapped again. The ship lost all power around 9 a.m. and was listing past 20 degrees. At 10:18, Abe released the crew to save themselves, but refused to give the abandoned ship order. By this time, Shinano was listing at 30 degrees. As she turned over, water rushed into the open elevator well on her flight deck, creating a vacuum that sucked swimming sailors back into the ship and took them with her. A large exhaust fan below the flight deck also sucked in many sailors that tried to escape. At 10:57 a.m., without having seen a single battle, Shinano finally capsized and sank stern first at 33 degrees 7 minutes north, 137 degrees 4 minutes east, 65 miles from the nearest land, in about 13,000 feet of water. As she sank, she took 1,435 officers, men, and civilians with her. Among the dead were Abe and both of his navigators, who all chose to go down with the ship. There was a total of 1,080 survivors, and among them were 65 officers, 993 petty officers and enlisted men, and 32 civilians. One of these survivors was Shoki Fuke. He was rescued after drifting for 12 hours after the sinking, and after the war, he'd go on to become an actor known for playing villains in movies and TV shows. After being rescued, the survivors were isolated on the island of Mitsukojima until January of 1945 to suppress the news of the carrier's loss. She was formally struck from the Naval Registry on August 31st, 1945. U.S. naval intelligence did not initially believe Commander Einright's claim to have sunk a carrier, and Shinano's construction wasn't detected through decoded radio messages or other means, so the Americans thought they'd already identified where the rest of Japan's surviving carriers were. This is despite the fact a captured Japanese aviator had revealed in July of 1943 that a third Yamato-class battleship was being converted into a carrier, and this was Shinano. Einright was eventually credited with sinking a 28,000 long-ton Hayatake carrier by the acting commander of the Pacific Fleet Submarine Force on the basis of a drawing Einright submitted depicting the ship he'd attacked. Once the existence of Shinano was confirmed, he was credited with her sinking and awarded the Navy Cross. Einright served in the U.S. Navy until 1963, and he passed away at the age of 89 on July 20th, 2000. Post-war analysis by the U.S. Naval Technical Mission to Japan noted that Shinano had serious design flaws. Specifically, the joint between the waterline armor belt on the upper hull and the anti-torpedo bulge on the underwater portion was poorly designed, a trait shared by the Yamato-class battleships. Archer Fish's torpedoes all exploded along this joint too. The force of the torpedo explosions also dislodged an I-beam in one of the boiler rooms, which punched a hole into another boiler room. In addition, the failure to test for water tightness in each compartment played a role as potential leaks could not be found and patched before Shinano headed out to sea. The executive officer blamed the large amount of water that entered the ship on the failure to air test the compartments for leaks. He reported hearing air rushing through gaps in the watertight doors just minutes after the last torpedo hit, and this was an excellent sign that seawater was rapidly entering the ship, proving the doors were unseaworthy. Shinano was destined for so much more than she truly accomplished. But thanks to fear, human error, and just terrible luck, she met her end just after her beginning. She leaves behind a legacy of catastrophic failure, echoing that of the other Yamato-class ships before her. The first ocean liner to be larger than the Great Eastern in tonnage splashed into the ocean early in 1901, the next phase for the White Star Line. She was the first of 4 sisters, and she'd hold her head high for a career that lasted more than 20 years, though it would unfortunately end in disaster. In next week's episode of Shipwreck Sunday, we start our celebration of the Big Four with RMS Celtic.